Great. Well, thank you, John, up there, for inviting me back to come and talk to you guys about some of the most interesting stuff that I've seen on my kind of weird travels and adventures that I've been doing this year. In short, just in the interest of time, I'm a futurist, which essentially means that I spend my time meeting the weirdos, troublemakers, and geniuses that are building the future for us. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of the, well, 4 of the things that I've seen this year. I think are defining perhaps what's going to come in the next few decades. And I think the most important thing to drive home is that we need to ask some really serious and really big questions about some of these technologies. And so I'm going to kick off by talking about sensors. We are today indexing the physical world in the same way that we indexed the internet with Google. And I want to explain what I mean by that and why I think that's really important. Because the digital layer that kind of wraps around the world today is constantly thinking about us, processing that information about us, and categorizing us in ways that we may not be comfortable with. So I'm going to discuss that a little bit now. Because the more sensors than there are out there, the more data that we share, the more companies and governments can layer services and products on top of that data and start tailoring the world to us. So I'm going to talk a little bit about those sensors. And starting in outer space, this is the Kaaba being watched from a satellite. You can actually see the movement of humans there. Video is becoming a sensor. So I'm going to talk about how that is really important. We're being observed by these mini satellites. And, of course, swarms of drones. We are going to see many more of these surveillance swarms that I've heard mentioned several times this year that are going to be monitoring and watching our every behavior. And aside from driving us around, the autonomous vehicles, as Google's Waymo project, is going to stream continuous high-definition 360 video about every city and every place that they're driving around. By putting AI chips into all these cameras can automatically then spot people, spot actions, and start to analyze and make sense of all these sensors. I was speaking recently at a conference to a bunch of 8 to 13-year-olds at the Royal Geographical Society, and the speaker before me was a hacker. And just by typing some stuff into his laptop whilst we were there at the conference, he was able to hack into a whole load of CCTV cameras that are around us at the RGS, literally just by using Google, not even the dark web. He also showed the feed from what he said was the inside of a nuclear power station, but I didn't want to see any more than that in case I incriminated myself in some way. You're going to hear a little bit about facial and emotion recognition technology a bit later on, but faces are, of course, just pixels. In Shenzhen, if you unwittingly jaywalk, you are very rapidly both humiliated and prosecuted by these large billboards that the police have put up. And if being observed outside our house isn't enough, we, of course, inside our homes willingly hand over information about ourselves to the ambient intelligence that's being built into speakers, into the fabric of our houses. Dina Katabi at MIT has brought out this incredible new sensor technology that was built for a fall detection system so that your grandparents can be monitored in their house. But essentially what it means is that these sensors through walls can monitor who is standing up or indeed lying down and not breathing, and therefore alerting, of course, whoever's on the other end of the button. But I'm sure there'll be other uses. Seeing through walls sounds like something that some people might be quite interested in leveraging. And even engineering organisms. We are now engineering tiny little bacteria. In the same way that engineers tinker with robots, they're being turned into little sensors so they can spot either things going on in our gut that perhaps we don't like, or perhaps toxins in our kitchens or whatever else. So from satellites to autonomous vehicles, drones, swarms, to biological cells, all of the atoms in the world are being turned into sensors and actuators, monitoring and observing pretty much everything that we're doing and responding to our behavior. And this, of course, blurs the boundary of a few things. Blurs the boundary between what's real and what's digital. Blurs the boundary between man and machine. Because, of course, once our car is a computer, our house is a computer, our body is a computer, our office is a computer, the AI then that you can put into that makes sense of those sensors and tailors the world, changes the physical world to suit us individually. Because I think we're probably going to have our own personal algorithm, a kind of bundle of our dreams, our desires, our experiences, all wrapped up in some mathematics, which is my definition of an algorithm. And that will interact with the city's algorithm, or with our friend's algorithm, or with a brand's algorithm, a bit like these advertising campaigns now are becoming much more targeted. This is one outside Westfield. for Renault, and recently, I don't know why there wasn't more of a media furore about this, but the recent turning back on of the Piccadilly Circus lights, these are pre-programmed adverts that respond to the groups of people around them, in terms of how tall those people are, their age, their gender. Those pre-programmed adverts are tailored to us, and the same for the Wi-Fi that's free that comes with this billboard. If you're around the billboard, you access the Wi-Fi. Again, the adverts will be tailored to you. And if algorithms, which they do online already, take into account your phone that you're using when you're Googling something, or indeed the postcode from where you're Googling it, and adjust the price accordingly, I can imagine that in the real world, that same sort of thing will start to happen in a sort of physical environment. And plenty of financial services innovations today are already giving us the option to have mortgages or other financial services given to us based on our data, based on our LinkedIn profile or our Facebook information. It's actually a real problem for me because I've been friends with a guy who is a chief futurist at the FBI for quite a long time. And his sage advice to me a while back was always confuse the internet. Give it lots of false information about yourself. Tell it you're a man and a woman and you're really old and you're really young and you order dog food once every 6 months or whatever else. Really baffle the internet. And of course, now I might have compromised myself to ever access any financial services in the future. So I might have to go back to him and have some stern words. But either way, innocuous things that we do on a daily basis are becoming a measure of our character. And of course, China, ever the market leader in surveillance technology, has launched or will be launching something called the social credit score. Now, this is the ability to access financial services or loans or privileges at hospitals or education systems based on a number. And that number is calculated on your real life and your digital behavior. If you play video games for 10 hours a day online, you are then deemed an irresponsible, an idle person. If you buy nappies in the supermarket, then perhaps you're a parent, and they therefore intuit that you might be on balance more responsible maybe than the video gaming guy. So it's not just investigating behavior, it is in fact nudging citizens away from things that the government doesn't want you to do. If you hang out with people who have a lower score than you, that will also adversely affect your score. And that score is already being used on dating sites as a measure of your character. Although, before we get too snotty here in the West, what I often hear when I'm in China is, well, at least our government tells us that they're surveilling us, which is a fair point. China, of course, has been what they call face swiping for years. When you go into a KFC, they will helpfully give you menu suggestions based on your face. Or indeed, if you're an Alibaba user, you can use your face as your payment device. This is the Smile to Pay technology. And this stuff is pretty interesting, but I think is going to get weirder as the body net, which is a concept that we have sensors woven into our clothes and perhaps even on skin sensors or embedded into other parts of us. The built environment, I believe, will be much more personalized to us. Rooms might adjust their temperature based on our temperature. Their lighting might be adjusted to our sort of circadian rhythms. All kind of things that I believe are just getting started. And as, of course, the information that we consume changes shape, where the world is going to start loading around us rather than loading on a screen, that nudging that I talked about earlier is going to become ever more pervasive, perhaps something that we will call peak nudge. I think we're already rapidly approaching that. But if we are living in a holographic universe, which I believe we are, let's make sure it's a desirable one. Let's not sleepwalk into something that we don't want, where we're nudged into oblivion, even perhaps where it starts to undermine democracy. Because if all our decisions, of course, are being made by artificial intelligence, perhaps we don't need to make any at all. And to move swiftly, because I haven't got an enormous amount of time, onto the second point I want to talk about. It isn't that data is just shaping how we interact with information. It is shaping the physical plumbing of the physical world. And I want to talk about this concept of a physical internet that I've been exploring recently. So if we consider that today, probably the biggest branch for NatWest or any other bank is the 752 from Reading to Paddington, we are forced to think very differently about what physical space and what physical assets actually mean and their role in our lives. Because one of the biggest innovations or characteristics or lessons of the internet is that open interoperability, difficult word to say, is vital. So the internet, to explain that, is not a series of walled gardens, or it shouldn't be. It is instead this glorious Cambrian explosion of connections. But the same concept of this open interoperability where everything is connected is coming to transport. And I want to talk a bit about the concept of how that is turning the world into a physical internet where we transport people, we transport goods, we transport vehicles even, in the same way that we transmit data across the internet today. So let's consider the autonomous vehicle again. This is not a car, it is a computer on wheels. It's very important to remember and understand that. It is a node in a super network. It is not what we have previously considered it to be, part of a bigger, amorphous concept that is much more similar to the internet than a series of individually owned, unconnected, depreciating lumps of metal. Another piece of this super network puzzle could be the Hyperloop. Now, for those of you who haven't come across the Hyperloop, I was there at the offices in Los Angeles a bit earlier this year. This is Virgin's Hyperloop One. It's essentially talking about digging a tunnel under the earth to connect cities or big population centers using magnetic levitation in a vacuum tube, which obviously sounds fairly simple from an engineering perspective, I'm sure. But essentially the object is to transport people and freight in the same way in little pods faster than airline speeds. And apparently the technology is actually not the issue. The issue is the regulation and where they're going to actually start putting this into practice. But the concept is, and this is the Nevada desert, by the way, where they're testing this technology now, and again, it's been very, very successful and gone incredibly fast, that you can connect cities like Los Angeles and San Francisco, for example, connect cities like Dubai and Abu Dhabi, and be able to live in one and work in the other in a perfectly normal way. You could live in Edinburgh, for example, and work in London. Now, this is not about a faster train, a bit like the autonomous vehicle not being a car. This is about an entirely new paradigm of transport that whisks us around the world like the physical internet, seamlessly. And the data around these kind of businesses, I think, is going to be phenomenal. I think they're going to be some of the world's biggest data companies, and they will sell that information about us in the same way that Google, of course, and Facebook and others sell our search information already. And if you add into this physical internet swarms of drones, or indeed, as Elon Musk recently announced with his working title BFR, that we'll essentially be able to get, as this video demonstrates, from New York to Shanghai in a rocket, in less than 35 minutes. I'm going to talk a little bit about space later on. But when you start plugging in factories and warehouses into this incredible physical internet, you'll start looking at things like this. This is Velodyne's mega factory, a fully automated, essentially a giant robot that makes the LiDARs, so that those things that sit on top of an autonomous vehicle so they know where they're going. So this will be a fully automated factory that needs no car park, no lighting, no canteen, nothing. It is a machine that makes a machine. And the factory of the future, I think, will look far more like a server farm than it will anything that Henry Ford or anyone else would recognize. And closer to home, Ocado's warehousing is very similar. Again, plugging into this physical internet to be able to move goods around the world in the same way, again, that we will send packets of information. These giant robots, these massive warehouses and factories, are an entirely new transport infrastructure that I'm really fascinated about exploring. These are not about faster individual vehicles. This is an entirely new paradigm shift that I think is really, really interesting. Now, of course, if all this is going to happen, we're going to have to be able to trust the machines, arguably a bit more than we're able to trust them today. In an environment that's mediated by technology, the boundary between us and the machine, between us and a company, between us and the government, again, is blurring in fairly, sometimes uncomfortable ways. So let's talk about robots. We have mixed feelings about robots. We tend to anthropomorphize them, which is always amusing. We lurch haphazardly between feeling sympathetic for them, like a lot of people did when someone was poking this Atlas robot from Boston Dynamics with a hockey stick. And then at the same time, I would venture to say that even while you're feeling sorry for this robot, you would not want to meet it in a dark alley. To try and counter some of those fears and smooth the transition to us working with the robots, which we will inevitably be doing quite soon, I'm sure. Labs like this one, Stochastic Labs, which is a bunch of engineers, but also artists and creatives, create robots that perhaps seem more vulnerable around us as humans. And what I mean by that is that they have both these lovely goggly eyes and a smile on their face, and they're made of cardboard, which is, of course, a very non-threatening material. But they will essentially trundle up to a person and say, I'm lost, I don't know where I am, can you sort of point me in the right direction? And the human will often pick it up and put it in, off to the cafe or wherever it asks to go. Now, of course, the robot has GPS on board. It knows exactly where it probably knows where it is more than the human knows where it is. But the point is this vulnerability is baked in deliberately to make us feel less threatened by robots. In fact, they have a version which will bang up against a wall, over and over again. And people will always come and pick it up and point it, and let it go. And of course, again, it's pre-programmed to do that. And I think we're going to have even more mixed feelings about the robots as they start telling on us. On the left here, you can see that a man's pacemaker did not corroborate his alibi that he was not, in fact, burning down a house when he perhaps was. And that data was used in court against him. On the right here, you'll see that a guy was murdered in his hot tub in Arkansas while there was an Amazon Echo nearby. Of course, the police wanted the data from Amazon in case he was saying something incriminating as he was being murdered, like "Don't kill me, Jim," or whatever. It's quite useful information if you're a policeman. Amazon said, no, that's private data. You can't have it. Long story short, they subpoenaed. Amazon got the information, and there were prosecutions. The point is that we're going to have to completely revisit everything, policy, security, because these new precedents are going to be set by these technologies. And we can't trust the robots without transparency. And this is really, really important. As AI and these other technologies get more sophisticated, they become more opaque. And they become more opaque, baked in with the biases of the people that program them. And luckily, we have some amazing citizen organizations like the Algorithmic Justice League here who will help us unpick that bias. Because it's easy to think, oh, well, they're robots. They're going to be completely unbiased. They can help us perhaps make less biased decisions, particularly if judges, make different decisions before lunch as they do after lunch, which is apparently what happens. But the problem is that if you give an algorithm some biased data, so you give it a bunch of faces, for example, and get them to train on that data, and that data isn't completely representative of the population, asking the algorithm then what is beautiful or what does a criminal look like comes out with some results that we perhaps should be checking very, very carefully. I was completely alarmed to read recently that AI is training on YouTube, learning how to be human. And it made me think, does YouTube really represent the human condition with all our nuances? And I just thought, gosh, that's a really scary concept. The next thing that's really important for us to be able to trust is asymmetry at the moment with robotics. I was in LA over the summer. I often would find a drone in the garden of the house, the Airbnb that I was renting. I didn't know whose drone it was flying around me. Was it a hobbyist? Was it the police? Was it an estate agent looking around the area? I had no idea. It was a totally asymmetrical relationship. And given the facial recognition and the gait recognition and all kinds of things that robot can do about me, that's a very asymmetrical relationship that we haven't established the rules for yet. Also, I want to think about ownership. Who owns the data that's being collected about us? And again, who could then sell that on in creative ways? But the biggest question I think we need to ask is who's going to help us with this? Who can help us think through this sort of quagmire of questions that we are faced with today? And we need some technically literate philosophers. We have a few, but unfortunately we've rather underfunded the humanities over the last 50 years. And as a result, we don't have enough of these people helping us to sort of forge some of these questions, which, as I heard in Berkeley relatively recently, just casually thrown out there by an AI scientist there, experts in artificial intelligence or nuclear tech are rarely also experts in human extinction risk. And I heard that and I thought, yes, you're quite right. We do need more people thinking about this, perhaps in more important ways. Because as we become more entangled with the machines further and further, and as we consider now the wide open frontier of cognitive augmentation, the fact that we're going to be upgrading our own wetware, our poor, sad, wet organic brains need a bit of a boost. If we take this seriously, a lot of these incredible science and tech innovations that are happening to augment our memories or download or upload information into our brains, I think these questions about ethics and security and privacy probably become a little bit more important more quickly. And what do I mean by this? This concept of techno-doping, of augmenting ourselves? Well, companies like Kernel, for example, started by a guy who sold his company to PayPal, I believe, and used the proceeds to start this incredible neuroprosthesis company. And what he intends to do by inserting this neuroprosthesis is to help us learn faster, remember more, co-evolve with artificial intelligence, not entirely sure what he means by that, unlock the secrets of telepathy, connect into group minds, and finally, download skills, such as martial arts. And so that's his vision. Him and Elon Musk with Neuralink, with Facebook's Building 8, all kinds of companies spending a lot of money thinking about how we're going to upgrade and insert devices into our brains that I would argue we need to think quite carefully about. For example, who has access to that information? Who has the IP over a product that is in essence a product of our most personal thoughts? These huge questions that we need to think about pretty rapidly as we're barreling into the future very quickly. I'm going to finish, and brain science is the new rocket science apparently, so lots of people are working on it. And so I'm going to finish by talking about space, because if this is the How to Change the World conference, I think that a lot of things that are going to change the world are actually going to happen because of the funky stuff that we're doing out in space. So I'm going to start with this concept of space commerce, that in fact, rather than just being this sort of huge government program, we of course have many private individuals who are working in the private space industry, and it is a rather he who dares wins kind of environment at the moment. But there's about 6 or 7 different really important developments that have happened this year that I'm going to rattle through before I finish. And the first is about rockets. Elon Musk has, of course, famously with his company SpaceX, created the reusable rocket, a completely foreign concept to any national or international space agency until he started his company. And these are some of the 16 consecutive perfect landings that he has done with his rockets, which is absolutely extraordinary. They are so precise, in fact, that he said whilst showing this video that those legs, like stabilizer type things that come down, are actually not necessary anymore. They could, in fact, just land on the launch mounts. That is how precise they're able to get these rockets to land back down again. And this huge new rocket, the BFR, that he has just announced, is going to be so big that the payload, the bit with all the, you can put the stuff rather than the fuel, can fit several of, or I think he said up to 16 or something, of his existing rockets just in the nose cones. This is a massive rocket that he's working on at the moment. The second thing that I think is really interesting about space is the incredible insight that we'll get into the biological sciences. This is some DNA sequencing happening out on the International Space Station. They've sequenced 1 billion base pairs in space now. So incredible information that we'll get about the human body and the changes that a zero-gravity environment has on that. But the major medical advances, I think, are going to happen because of the experiments that are happening in space. For some reason, I'm sure some of the academics later today can tell you better than me, bacteria that transmit disease become more and more virulent in space than they do on Earth. Understanding what triggers that could be a really, really interesting way to stop pandemics or limit the impact of pandemics on Earth. Or indeed, having no gravity is actually a huge benefit to science. If you think about the regenerative medicine, growing organs and that kind of thing, having no gravity is actually a splendid environment to grow tissue. Some really interesting advances, I think, will happen with that. The third thing I want to talk about was manufacturing. Unless we can make things in space, we'll never be able to colonize it. Because if we have to keep sending up spare parts and things we've forgotten from Earth, we're never going to get anywhere. So companies like Made in Space, which I was lucky to work alongside in the early 2010s, are making these massive space factories. It's called the Archinaut. It essentially just 3D prints out in space, which means you can make massive objects, huge satellites, like dainty things that you couldn't send up in a rocket because the trauma of launch is too much. Things that don't have any constraints whatsoever, because obviously the constraints on Earth are rather different to those in zero gravity. And in fact, Jeff Bezos thinks we shouldn't do any industry or manufacturing on Earth. We should do it all in space. He's a little bit more ambitious, perhaps, than some of us, but I have full confidence in his ability. In fact, he just sold a whole bunch of Amazon shares in order to fund more of his Blue Origin project. The fourth thing I want to talk about is mining these things, asteroids. chasing lumps of rock essentially around the galaxy and parking them somewhere so that you can extract resources that they have on board, which again is my definition of mining asteroids. Most, of course, of these things are inert lumps of rocks and dirt, not terribly useful, but some of them are solid metal, really useful, and some of them have water on board, which is very, very important. 2 trillion tons of water, apparently, according to Planetary Resources, are something we can access while in space. It's obviously useful for us if we're going to be colonizing Mars, but particularly useful because fuel, which usually takes up about 90% of a rocket's payload, could actually be made using this water. So we wouldn't have to carry enough up to be able to get back down again. We could, in fact, make the fuel in space. And in case you're intrigued and want to take part, asterank.com is a great resource to see which of these asteroids are worth getting out of bed for, because their dollar value is all listed helpfully here for you. Not just Planetary Resources, Deep Space Industries, plenty of new types of manufacturing concepts, which are, of course, only cartoons at this stage. We don't really know what this is going to look like, but I am assured that this stuff is the low-hanging fruit of the solar system, and that all my questions are very pedestrian compared to their ambitions. But finally, talking about pedestrian ambitions, let's talk about Mars. In this latest update that Elon Musk gave about his BFR, he talked about colonizing Mars, or at least getting people to Mars, by 2022. He said that wasn't a typo, but he did say that it was aspirational. And that's something I think we can all appreciate. But there are plenty of designs about how we are going to colonize Mars, how we're going to 3D print or create these incredible buildings to the fixer-upper of the planet that Mars is. It's pretty cold, it's got almost no atmosphere, dust storms that can cover the whole planet, which sounds a bit alarming, and 125 degrees below at the poles. My favorite concept of this sort of Mars colonization, again, comes from Elon Musk and his incredible ambitions to do this sort of thing. And, of course, my favorite quote from him about Mars as well. So to finish, I just wanted to say a couple of things. And that is first, that I don't want us to sleepwalk into an undesirable future. I think that is a very possible outcome. And now is the time to be asking some major questions on how we feel about putting some ethics and privacy, security, transparency around some of this technology. These are hugely powerful technologies that will help us solve some of the greatest challenges that we face out there. But let's use them to create the world that we want. Thank you.